I'm not a professional fisherman, but I like to think of myself as a pro because I take it very seriously and I do it every chance I get. Let's just say I go fishing anytime I'm not at my day job. In a similar fashion, I have fished in many places. But my favorite places to fish are rivers and lakes. And in my state, that usually means going to the mountains. I'm very good at what I do. I never come home without some fresh trout in my hand. So when I returned from this particular trip without any fish, my partner was very confused as to why. I've never experienced anything like this before, and I've been to the mountains countless times. I know the wildlife. I know the layout of the land. But what I saw on that trip made me fearful to ever return. It was getting close to late fall/early winter when I decided to take a few days up in the mountains. It's really my last hurrah for the year, and I wanted to stock up for the winter. I took 4 days off, but I only planned to be gone for 2. I love being outdoors, but not when it's frigid. So I wanted to come back home in decent weather. I packed up my things, said my farewells, and I started driving towards my favorite fishing spot. The wind was pretty cold, but the sun was out and shining, and the skies seemed pretty clear. Getting to my favorite fishing area was a bit of work because it's not easy to find unless you know where you're going. It's not much of a fork in the road, but it looks like it if you look hard enough. And I always take the less driven path to the left, the way you can't easily spot. I don't really take people to this spot. It was a secret fishing area that my dad would take me to, and I like to keep it private. Anyways, I take the left path on the fork in the road and I drive a ways until I see a small clearing and the river. I unload all my things, including my tent, and I get my hooks in the water as quickly as I can. Being up there usually gives me time to avoid thinking too much. So I usually watch the ripples in the water or I watch the sky change colors. I hadn't gotten a bite by the time the sky started changing pink. I was growing a little frustrated, but I knew I'd have the next day, especially that early morning, to catch something. I caught myself really looking at the trees for the rest of my time. They just looked really nice in the lighting. I'm kind of mad I hadn't really noticed them before. So anyways, I'm looking at the trees across the river from me. There's plenty of them to hide something like a deer or what have you, but the trees weren't very tall, especially not by the riverbed. A lot of trees had burnt down a few years prior, so there were areas that seemed to be a little more bare than nature intended. It seems like I'm babbling, but a lot of this is really important for you to understand. You see, I'm as skeptical about things as anyone. But what I saw wasn't a deer or bear. As I'm looking out towards the trees across the river, I can see between the trees, especially towards the tops of the smaller trees closest to me. But going back, it seemed to get more dense. And then a little beyond that, it was sparse again. There were holes, gaps between the dense trees. Anyways, I'm looking out, and I see something that looks low to the ground. It's in the sparse area several feet from the river. But there's a lot more trees in front of it than I realize. A half an hour passed, she didn't return. Then an hour passed, she still wasn't in that seat. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Was she even really there at all? Time seemed to fly by. Eventually we made our way into Chicago. When I got up from my seat, I could have sworn someone had touched my hair. I looked around, but there was no one near me enough to do that. I kept my eyes open as we disembarked from the train, and as I made my way through the station, I called an Uber to bring me to my friend's house in Canaryville. I didn't have to wait long for the Uber, but I kept looking around trying to see that girl again. The Uber driver made small talk. He was a nice enough guy, but I just wanted to get to my friend's house as fast as possible. I still couldn't wrap my head around what had happened on the train. I looked out the window as Chicago pasted by, taking in the city, the people. We get to my friend's and I pay the Uber. I get out of the car and I feel a cold chill down my spine. I turn around and there she is across the street. Her black eyes staring straight at me and her blonde hair blowing in the wind. I run up to my friend's door and knock as fast as I can. He pulls it open and I almost jump inside his house. I point across the street and tell him what happened on the train in. He starts laughing, but he looks across the street and his face turns white. He sees her standing there, his mouth almost drops to the floor. She turns her head and nods towards us, then just disappears when a car drives by. We both lose it and go out of the house looking around for her. The neighbors look at us like we're insane. My friend goes and asks if anyone saw the girl standing across the street. One of them did, but didn't understand why we were acting so crazy. We stayed up all night talking about it with some of our other friends. We kept looking outside, waiting to see if the girl would show up again across the street. I never believed in weird or strange stories before. I'd always say that people were making it up or something. That was until something weird happened to me. That changed my life. Now I can't help but think there's some truth in everything people encounter. Details might not be clear or whatever, but it doesn't mean it didn't actually happen. I was riding the train into Chicago. It's a great experience, it really is, and it shows you how people used to travel back before the invention of cars. People make fun of me for how much longer it takes, but it's just the experience of it. There's always a few interesting people on the train as well, and I've spent many hours drawing the different people sitting on the train. It's a great exercise for anyone who's into the arts, and great practice drawing people in motion, learning anatomy. I also like to look out the window at the different stops the train makes as well. During one of these stops, I was looking out the window, kind of daydreaming, not really paying attention to anything. Something or someone moved and caught my eye, and I turned my head and see this girl. She was alone, no one standing around her, her back turned to me, with long blonde hair that almost reached the small of her back. I didn't really think anything of it, and the train eventually went on its way. I began doodling, not really drawing anything, just making shapes and scribbles. 2 stops later, I swear I see the same girl. Long blonde hair, arms wrapped around a book held to her chest, standing alone. This time she turns her head slowly and looks right at me. Her eyes are solid black, shiny, almost like precious stones. Her face was expressionless. She just stared at me until the train started up again. I thought maybe I didn't get enough sleep. Maybe I saw it wrong, or I was just imagining it because I had been daydreaming on and off. Like when you get super bored sometimes, and you swear you saw something this way, or you picked up something from the store but you actually didn't. I just kept telling myself that until we made the next stop. She was there again. This time people were walking past her, but it seemed like they didn't notice she was there. She looked right at me, eyes big and black, but it almost seemed like she was looking through me. This time she got on the train. I panicked a little, dropping my pencil, my hand shaking a little. I bent down to get my pencil from the floor, then just waited. Something told me she'd end up in my train car. I sat in my seat waiting, sweating, my hand shaking every time I tried to draw. I'd look around from time to time, but I didn't see the girl. I just stared out the window, trying to take my mind off of what I had seen. I started to calm myself down a bit. An hour went by without me really noticing. I don't know why, but I began to look around at the people sitting around me. Far off at the opposite end from where I was sitting, I saw the top of a blonde head. The hair looked like it was straight. It looked like it could be the girl I had seen at the other stops with the black eyes. I closed my sketchbook, slid the pen in the metal rings that bound it, and just started tapping my foot. Panic began to swell up inside me. Looking out the window wasn't working anymore, so I got up to find a restroom. When I walked back to my seat, she wasn't there anymore. The blonde head wasn't in the seat I saw her in. At first, I thought I'm looking at a bear cub, something small and dark, much darker than a deer, and it's not really moving. So that seemed odd. I'm not a scientist, but I do know that bears don't really sit idle. They move, especially little cubs. They've got places to be. So the longer I'm looking at this dark, hairy mass, the more I'm starting to wonder what it's doing. I noticed my fishing pole starts to rattle a little, so I reach my hand out to grab it. As soon as I do this movement, I notice that the dark thing moves. So my reflexes caused me to look back up towards it. The thing was much closer now, standing in front of the dense area that was hiding it before. As I said, the trees in front of the dense area were pretty short. So, when this thing moved forward, I could see that it was much larger than I thought. It seemed to be standing on its hind legs, but it was crouching down to meet the tops of the smaller trees. The only reason I know this is because I could see what appeared to be fingers wrapping over the tops of its knees. Aspen trees don't have much to them, especially not near the base. So even though the thing thought it was hiding, I could see lots more than it must have thought. What really freaked me out were the eyes looking at me from atop that small tree. They were dark, just like the hair on it, but they seemed much more deep, like they were curious. It didn't seem threatening at first, so I tried to walk closer to the river without looking away. But as soon as I stepped closer, it stood up straight and disappeared back into the dense trees behind it. That thing towered over the juvenile aspen. If I had to guess, I'd say the aspen was around 4, 5 tall. And this thing was nearly twice the size, but it glides into the trees with ease, like it was used to being hidden away despite how big it was. I know it sounds crazy, but whatever it was looked more human than beast, especially in those eyes. And with that, I decided to pack up all my things and go back home. I didn't even spend the 2 days I had planned. My dad was military, so we moved around a lot. Like, a lot. It seemed every 4 years we were getting stationed in another state. We had just been stationed in Colorado Springs, and I was seriously excited. I had missed the snow after being in Texas for the last 4 years. The house that my parents rented for us seemed pretty nice. It was really big, had more than enough rooms, and it even had an awesome basement. I was really excited about the basement. Having a room that was underground and pretty much soundproof from the outside seemed perfect. We had only been there a couple of weeks, and we were all settling in quickly. We were so used to the moving that it no longer was a big deal. I had just finished setting up my drums in the basement and was about to get the amp for my guitar plugged in, and everything would be perfect. Things were coming along nicely, and I was very happy that my parents were letting me make this area mine. I hadn't been able to really play in a while. I sat back on the couch that they bought for me and strummed a little, testing the sound and ensuring I had it all tuned and the amp keyed up right. Suddenly, the room got colder. It didn't really faze me, though. This wasn't my first rodeo with a cold state. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and played my favorite song by memory. Having my own musical space away from my little brother was honestly perfect. No one to touch my stuff or mess with my settings. The peaceful feeling didn't last long, though. I was just hitting the second bridge when I heard it. It sounded like nails on a chalkboard and gave me goosebumps. I hate that sound. I opened my eyes and looked around wildly, trying to understand where it was coming from. That's when the lights started flickering. But I mean, this house was pretty old, so maybe the wiring was janky. I decided to head upstairs. I mean, maybe my parents could contact the landlord and have someone come check out the wiring for us. I had made it about halfway up the stairs when the door slammed shut. I stopped in my tracks and stared at the door. What on earth was going on? I ran up the last of the stairs and tried to open the door. It wouldn't budge. Panic was taking over and I started banging on it. I was legitimately terrified. I screamed for my mom and dad, even my brother. But no one was responding. I started trying to rationalize what was happening. If no one was answering, maybe they were playing a prank on me. Using this logic, I calmed down and went back down the stairs. If they wanted to scare me, I was going to act like nothing was going on. I had just started playing again when I started to feel the couch shift. I tried to ignore it, though. I was trying to keep my cool. I didn't need to panic when I was stuck in a room and couldn't escape. But soon the movements got harsher. It was definitely jerking around. I pulled my feet up on the couch and grabbed the arm, trying to keep myself from getting hurt while whatever was happening happened. I knew this wasn't a prank, but what could I do? The door was jammed and I couldn't get out. So I started trying to talk to whatever was doing this. I told them that I meant no harm and asked them to please let me out. I only made them angrier. The movements got a lot more forceful and the lights started cutting out. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The sound was back and 10 times louder. It was so loud that my head was starting to hurt. I started to cry. I was officially terrified and didn't know how to get this to stop. The lights started to stay off for longer periods. On, off for 30 seconds. On, off for 30 seconds, over and over. Soon the couch stopped getting jerked around, but I kept my feet up. I was hopeful that whatever was happening was almost over. I was so wrong. The next time the lights went out, there was a low growl. And when they came on, there, standing about 10 feet from me, was a teenage girl. Probably about 16. She was like mist, though. I could literally see my drums through her. But what really scared me was her eyes. They were like empty holes, pitch black and non-existent, and the blood drenching the front of her clothes. I screamed, but that just made her angry. She turned her eyeless face towards me and the couch lifted into the air 3 feet before crashing down again. I started crying harder, begging her to stop. She cocked her head at me, and this time when the couch lifted, it stayed. I was floating 3 feet off the ground, watching this thing look at me without eyes. She straightened her head before throwing it back. Across her throat was a huge cut. I screamed out again and grabbed the couch as it fell. The lights began to flicker again, as if I needed any help being more afraid. She was still there, watching me, until the 4th or 5th time the lights flashed. This time when they came on, she was gone. The door flew open, and the room returned to the normal temperature. I looked around the room, trying to make sure I was really alone before standing up. I have never ran so fast upstairs in my life. My parents still don't believe me. No one heard me screaming or begging for help. I never stepped foot down in the basement again.